In this podcast, we've introduced you to Olney as a neighborhood that's experienced less gentrification than the rest of Philadelphia. And make no mistake, Philadelphia is and has been gentrifying.
Developers are driving up housing costs and gobbling up properties in places nobody saw coming a decade ago. In South Philly.
And with easy access to downtown Center City, Philadelphia, that makes South Philly a more attractive area. And with heavy ticket prices attached, they are ranging from $300,000 to $800,000 with a 10-year tax abatement. And angry, long-time residents are fed up and are standing up, speaking out.
Like in North Philly.
The space is already owned by the university and currently used as a recreation and sports practice field. With the stadium site initially proposed in 2015 and on the brink of filing a formal application with the City Planning Commission, opposition came by the way of community residents, and one group in particular.
Basically across all of Philly, like the news covers we just played, provided by PhillyCam highlights.
And if you talk to some people, those forces may soon be pushed up into Olney too. But even by saying that gentrification is slower in Olney, we might have given you the wrong impression. Development is happening in the neighborhood. In fact, there are a number of notable projects underway. But if you look around in Olney, the development feels different. Like maybe it's built for the existing community rather than for attracting newcomers.
Olney Rec Center is undergoing a $10 million renovation through Mayor Jim Kenney's Rebuild Initiative, which is a citywide effort to improve libraries, parks, and rec centers.
Public spaces like Fisher Park and Tacony Creek have been cleaned up and brightened in recent years with the help of volunteers and environmental stewards, some of whom you're going to meet in this episode.
And maybe the most obvious sign of change underway in Olney has been the ongoing work in the North 5th Street Revitalization Project.
There wasn't really a Haitian population in Longcrest, but in Olney there's like a Haitian church and there was a market, and that's where our family just started to gravitate.
That's Stephanie Michel. She is the director of the North 5th Street Revitalization Project. Stephanie lives in the neighborhood and herself is Haitian American.
And I would say the Haitian population has definitely grown since 2000. Many Haitian women have started clothing businesses where they sell African garb and other things. So yeah, it's definitely, they're still here and they've grown as well, which is pretty cool to see. There's definitely a little village, a little Haitian village in Olney, and it's expanded to additional businesses opening up. So there's multiple Haitian barbershops, a new Haitian market, more Haitian churches.
Several people we interviewed described Stephanie as the person to talk to about the happenings in Olney. It's because of the work she does. For the last decade, Stephanie has been working to grow and assist the business community.
The economy was just plummeting 2010, 2011, and there weren't too many jobs. So I decided to do AmeriCorps Vista. And that's how I just put out an application and a position opened up at Fifth Street. They were looking for an AmeriCorps Vista. And it just seemed like the perfect opportunity, not too far from my house, something that I was kind of interested in. I really didn't know about corridor management or business and community and economic development. I just was I want to do nonprofit. This seems like a great opportunity. Why not give it a shot?
Taking that shot has turned into a decade's worth of work for Stephanie with the Revitalization Project.
Revitalization Project started back in 2007, 2008 with Barbara Bishop. She was a business owner along the corridor. She had Bishop Funeral Home. But she worked in Center City. And so she would come back home and she noticed whenever she came back from Center City that her neighborhood and her community and her corridor where her business was wasn't getting the same kind of love, attention, and care that business districts in Center City were getting. And so she started to do her research, figure out that there was programs that the city offered to support commercial corridors. And she decided to apply and submit an application and work with an organization that already existed. So there's the Korean Community Development Services Center. And so Barbara reached out to the director there to see if they could work together to bring a program that supported the commercial corridor on North Fifth Street. And so it actually happened. And so that's when it started. And it started with just Barbara Bishop, one sidewalk cleaner, and a corridor manager.
Almost 12 years later, it's still going. The Fifth Street Revitalization Project isn't a CDC, but it provides a lot of support services to Olney businesses. Things like grant applications, marketing and advertising plans for stores, working with police to promote public safety along the corridor, even street cleaning.
An awesome team of sanitation specialists who clean Fifth Street 7 days a week. And they clean from 5th and the Boulevard down to 5th and Spencer.
Stephanie says that all of these efforts are to connect businesses with their neighbors and vice versa, to strengthen community relationships through the traffic of the commercial corridor.
I'm always tooting as an asset for us is our diversity, because it truly is what makes our neighborhood like an amazing place to be for business owners and for people to live. Along the corridor, just a lot more businesses have moved in. It was busy back then, but it's a lot more busy now, which is exciting.
When I spoke to Stephanie a few months ago, she said that during COVID-19, only 2 out of about 390 businesses along the Fifth Street corridor were forced to shut down. That's pretty impressive. And it speaks to the resilience of the business community in Olney.
But it also speaks to the fact that even during a pandemic, people in Olney were interacting with their neighborhood in ways both new and old. They were involved with their surroundings even when life seemed at a distance. And that's the focus of today's episode, the built environment and public spaces of Olney, plus what they mean to the community.
Before William Penn colonized what we now know as the state of Pennsylvania in the late 17th century, the Olney section of Philadelphia was home to a community of Lenape Indians. These particular Lenape were known to be tall, incredibly peaceful, and a spiritual people. Their totem was a turtle, because they had a legend that at one point the entire world balanced on the back of a giant turtle. They shared a name with the language they spoke, the Unami, which means people downriver. Olney is remarkably different today, of course. The people downriver, the Unami, were displaced long ago by English colonists. And in the context of modern Philly, the neighborhood is something of an upriver community. On a map, Olney lies at the tippy top of the city. It borders Montgomery County and is the second to last stop on the northbound Broad Street subway line. But the neighborhood is also upriver in the sense that it doesn't seem shy to go against the current. It's a neighborhood with a blue-collar tradition that's been revitalized in recent decades, but without the levels of gentrification that we've seen in so many other parts of the city. Over the last 20 years, Olney has become increasingly non-white. It's a true melting pot, home to large communities of Korean, Colombian, and Mexican immigrants, along with families from Africa and the Caribbean. Researchers believe it is the most linguistically diverse part of Philadelphia. More than 1 in 3 people who live there was born outside the United States. In this podcast, we're going to introduce you to some of them and hear why this neighborhood is so special. You'll also hear about the history of Olney, including the racism some people faced as the neighborhood grew less white. You'll hear from chefs and artists, teenagers and teachers, pastors and nonprofit leaders. You'll hear about its food, its thriving business community, and its built environment. a co-production of Olney Culture Lab of Culture Trust Greater Philadelphia and Amber Art and Design. In partnership with June Lopez and Malcolm Burnley, this is Audio Only, a podcast exploring the beauty, complexity, and diversity of the Olney section of Philadelphia. We hope you enjoy. Major support for the Audio Only podcast is provided by the Independence Public Media Foundation. Additional support is provided by the William Penn Foundation and Collins Family ShopRite.
Ita, Kwango Mahumo, Eloansi Wilotanami Kekwan. I greet you in the language of my ancestors, the Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape people. My name is Trinity. I am a citizen of the Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape Nation of New Jersey, and I am here to do a land acknowledgement.
This was recorded on a Saturday morning in Olney at the end of April. You're going to hear more from this event in our future episode about food, but for now, let me just briefly set the scene for you. A dozen or so people are gathered at folding tables inside the North 5th Street office of the Cambodian Association of Greater Philadelphia. In the back, a traditional Cambodian breakfast is being served. Rice porridge full of savory meats and spices with fresh lime and cilantro as condiments on top. In the front of the room is a lectern where a series of speakers gives presentations. The event is called Cultivating Cambodian Refugee Roots in the City Toward Land and Water. Trinity Norwood is one of those speakers.
The Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape tribal nation, we are a sovereign nation comprised of the descendants of the original people of this very land. Far before these Philly streets were paved and these buildings erected, my ancestors lived, loved, and died right here. I'm honored to be here before you today and give a land acknowledgement.
It seems appropriate to begin the episode here with a recognition of what the landscape of Olney once was. As Trinity explains, that's essentially what a land acknowledgement is, and also why they're so powerful. And also why they've become an increasingly popular way to connect with the original inhabitants of a place in our built environment today.
Today, as I come before you, and you guys concentrate on honoring the land, I think that is the very essence of what a land acknowledgement is. A land acknowledgement honors the land you are on, whether physically, spiritually, or in today's world, virtually. And I don't believe that you can honor that land unless you acknowledge the history of that land. Recognizing the history ties us all to it in some sort of way. The domino effect that was created before we were even thoughts in our parents' minds that brought us to where we are today, being in this room together. It is a Lenape tradition that when we make decisions as a community, we think about how those decisions will affect our generations 7 years behind us and 7 years into the future.
Past, present, and future. These are ruminations that often arise from being out in the natural world. I speak from experience personally, as you know from our previous episodes. The woods are a happy place for Linda and I.
What do you think this one is with the yellow flowers? This one we might be able to get.
This is a northern spice bush.
Oh, cool. So what's the northern spice bush good for? What is the information about it?
We live close to Cobb's Creek Park and go walking through the woods with our dog Shayla almost every day. We like to educate ourselves on the plants that grow there, identifying them with this amazing act called seek. Usually has a yellow flower. It's been a real sense of new discovery in the woods, coming out here trying to identify each of the plants that we take for granted that just surround us on our daily walks. But when you sit down and really pay attention to them and do a little research, you find that just walking in the woods is like walking through the pharmaceutical office, because every single thing has a potential treatment to something that might be an ailment to yourself. And a lot of our newer medicines these are the real sources of them.
The pandemic has been an interesting time because while it's taken away some things, It's allowed us to spend a lot more time in nature. I think a lot more people have been coming out during the pandemic and enjoying public spaces more so than probably ever before, because indoor spaces, are limited, and people are starting to take more appreciation of the green space that we have and the nature that we have, and I think more ownership as well. And if you think we are tree huggers, then just wait for our next guest.
My name is Robin Irizarry. I am 34. I'm a Puerto Rican environmentalist working at the National Audubon Society Alliance and the Alliance for Watershed Education.
Robin was born and raised in Olney. He spent a lot of his childhood roaming around Fisher Park and Tacony Creek.
Growing up, I definitely thought that to really experience nature, I'd have to go someplace a lot farther than my own neighborhood. I grew up as a kid who loved animals, loved being outdoors, loved reading about animals. My brother played on the t-ball at the Olney Midget Team League there on the edge of Tacony Creek Park. I really didn't have an interest in baseball, so I would kind of, wander down into the woods and look for turtles and frogs and stuff like that. Growing up, I definitely thought that in order to see something as cool as like a bald eagle or beavers or something, I would have to go and travel someplace like Alaska. And now, having spent more time in these spaces as an adult and realizing, how cool these spaces are and the value that they have for wildlife, I'm excited to be able to see those things, bald eagles, beavers, deer, all sorts of really neat wildlife in those local parks, these small little parks in Olney and just in the middle of the city of Philadelphia.
Robin admired nature from a young age, but
what I didn't know then was kind of how complicated things kind of are in a bigger system like a city. So I didn't know that there are sewer lines that come into play with the creek. I didn't know that there are things like combined sewer outfalls that you want to be mindful of. You want to know about this stuff before you go spending, getting too close to the creek and spending. You want to at least know about these issues that are happening in our bigger city context.
The experience of growing up around nature, but not necessarily thinking about how your life impacts the natural world, is a common story. Jay Coriano, an artist who's recently worked on art projects in Tacony Creek Park, wasn't too aware of his relationship to Philly nature until he was an adult.
A lot of times we don't see or realize the opportunities that we have to connect with nature. And Tacony Creek Park is an outlet for us to go out there, take a walk, take a hike. I feel like a lot of people need time to just take a deep breath and enjoy a nice walk with nature. And being born and raised right here in Feltonville, all we really are used to is just a bunch of buildings and, cityscapes.
Jay painted a series of murals based on native flowers from the area, which you can find on the ground along the trails of Tacony Creek Park. It followed a different project where he designed bright and colorful trash can lids in Juniata Park toward the same end, to try to change how people think about their role in the natural world around them.
It's important that we are aware that a lot of the trash and the litter around this area, it goes into the Tacony Creek. A lot of times when it rains, the creek overfloods and it carries all that trash. And people aren't aware that this creek flows into the Delaware River, which is our main source of water. So it's important to spread that awareness, that just to clean up after ourselves, to just treat this place like it's home, not just big garbage place. I heard there was Forbes list or something. They said that Philadelphia was the most trashiest city, and it hits you a certain way. It's like, okay, like we really have to start doing something about this.
Environmental remediation has been an inspiration for Jay's artwork, and it became a career for Robin Irizarry.
It wasn't until I started getting older and learning more about nature that I started seeing what healthier ecosystems really look like outside of an urban setting, right? You see that when you go out into the woods, when you go camping, up in state parks or something like that, you don't have the same kind of issues, all the litter, issues of sewage and stuff like that. So it got my mind really thinking about like, okay, like these are spaces that I value, I think are really special. I want to be a part of the solution of making those spaces safer and healthier, better habitat for wildlife for people to hang out and enjoy. That led me down a path of going to school for landscape architecture and studying ecological restoration.
After spending a few years designing things like rain gardens, Robin began working with the Tacony-Frankford Watershed Partnership, better known as the TTF. The TTF is a nonprofit that, through philanthropy and partnerships with the city and surrounding counties, works to restore and promote 30 square miles of waterway in the area. They do physical work, like planting and pruning trees, along with initiatives like environmental justice education. And the work of TTF, since they formed in 2000, Robin says, has been paying off.
I think one of the neatest things is that we're at a time where our waterways, while they're still certainly degraded beyond what they would have been naturally had this area not been developed, we're at a point now where the Delaware River, the creeks surrounding, are cleaner than they've been in over 100 years because of things like the Clean Water Act and legislation that says like, hey, we can't be dumping this stuff in our creeks anymore. With the rivers being cleaner, we're starting to see wildlife that had been eliminated from this area starting to make a comeback. Beavers are definitely working their way into all our little creeks in Philadelphia.
Robin is still working on the future of the land in his current job. He runs a fellowship program that finds young people in communities like Olney to take on environmental stewardship roles.
Find young people who live in these communities where we're working, who are excited about this kind of stuff, who want to help teach others about the wildlife, the cool nature that they can see, but also how to protect your own drinking water, how to advocate for, healthier environment around your community. So we've been doing this program for the past 4 years. We're going into our 5th season. And it's essentially hiring young people for 12 weeks throughout the summer.
Green spaces are not only a refuge for both humans and animals, they can be the connective glue of a community.
So I mentioned I work for the Alliance for Watershed Education, and that's a network of 23 environmental centers around the Delaware River watershed. And a watershed is just all of the land where, the rain falls on the land and it's going to flow somewhere. Within a particular watershed, within the Delaware watershed, all that rain is flowing down to the Delaware River.
We mentioned that the Olney Rec Center is getting a $10 million makeover through Mayor Jim Kenney's Rebuild initiative. But it's not the only development targeting youth in the neighborhood.
I do believe that schools should be the hub in the neighborhood. That is where you should get all of your needs met. You're finding all the information. Kids are going to extracurriculars. I'm so excited about our new play space because it'll just further progress this vision of no matter where you live, you have access to what you need. You have access to a play space. You have access to a top-tier education. You have access to small class sizes, a playground and gardens and everything that I've found in other sectors of education in the city. We should have that accessible right here at Lowell, where you can walk around the corner and get everything you need. And so me, living around the corner just further deepens that desire to really make sure that Lowell is the community hub that it once was, and that I know it can continue to be in even greater ways.
That's Principal Chantelle Barr of Lowell Elementary School. As she mentioned, Lowell is in the process of building a top-notch playground installed at the school. Before that, the only play space was a cement slab that doubled as a parking lot. According to reporting by Nina Feldman at WHYY, Lowell and 2/3 of the other public elementary schools in the Philadelphia School District don't have playgrounds. Luckily, that's about to change.
The fact that the 47 will ride down 5th Street and there's a beautiful play space that people do not think schools within a quote impoverished community can have. I always see the more privileged schools getting all of these extra supports, all of these extra facilities and things like that. And people often believe that the school district of Philadelphia just can't have those pieces. I know as a young parent years ago, I believed those things when I started looking at different places and different schools and where I was eventually going to go and teach at.
In 2018, Lowell began partnering with the Trust for Public Land to design and fundraise for the project, and is now in the final stages of completion. Soon there will be swings and 19 feet tall climbing structures at Lowell.
This playground will mean so much for our students and staff and the community. Every school I've worked at that has not been a district school has had a playground on site, has had a garden, has had access to an outdoor learning classroom, all of those extra pieces that really enrich the school environment. And so our students were so happy. They were able to design the play space. They wrote letters to the board to help get the playground approved. So now we have our students actually having their voice being heard. They read out who the letters were from at the school board meeting.
And that's not it for Lowell Elementary. The school could be eligible for federal funding through President Joe Biden's American Rescue Plan. And it might help that one of the congressmen who voted in favor of the bill is an alumni of Lowell Elementary.
My mom worked on 5th Street for the better part of 3 decades. And given that whether it was at Lowell or St. Helena's, I spent a lot of time, 9 years in classrooms in schools that were on 5th Street, spent a fair share of time staring out the windows in those buildings, looking out on 5th Street.
That's Congressman Brendan Boyle, who represents Northeast Philly and parts of Montgomery County in Congress. He's a rising star in the Democratic Party, but he comes from humble roots in the neighborhood. Congressman Boyle's mom was a crossing guard who worked at the corner of Fisher Park and 5th Street.
I was pretty lucky where I grew up that we had 3 public parks, all very nearby, and took full advantage of all of them. When I was growing up in Olney, there were just a ton of kids. And so I was very much into sports, and it was pretty easy to find a game at one of those 3 parks.
Making sure the next generation has the same, or better, public spaces to enjoy and explore in Olney is one of the congressman's priorities.
Right before the pandemic, I went back to Lowell Elementary and did a tour of the building. And, it is very much an older building. The facility, unfortunately, is in bad need of repair. In one classroom, for example, it was so hot, it felt like a sauna, and the teachers, even though this was a very cold day in January, I think, when I was there, the teacher had to have all the windows open, and it still felt like a sauna in there. And yet then when you stepped right into the hallway, the temperature dropped to about 50 degrees. And you had part of the roof that's falling in, leaks in different aspects, obvious signs of asbestos. That's a great example of why we need, and this is part of what's in the American Rescue Plan, getting our schools up to code, improving their ventilation, and improving the physical infrastructure. So I've worked very hard on the American Rescue Plan, was a strong supporter of it. I serve on the House committee that has jurisdiction over it, so I spent a lot of time working on it, getting through the committee process, and then finally helping push it on the House floor over to the Senate, then back again to the House for final passage before it was signed by the president.
The American Rescue Plan was passed by both chambers of Congress, then signed into law by President Biden on March 11th.
And so sometimes when you focus on legislation in Washington, it's hard to draw that direct link back home. This is a case where it's pretty easy to do it because there is literally over $100 billion in this rescue plan that will go toward America's schools. And so schools like Lowell, other public schools will be able to draw on those resources and be able to make the sort of improvements so that they can fully reopen and improve their ventilation and improve things in the middle of a pandemic.
During the pandemic, a lot of people were wishing for a reset button to return to a time before the masks, before the anxiety, and above all, before the Zoom calls. Hitting the reset button on our built environment and public space is more complicated, and in many cases, impossible. As the world turns, so does the look and feel of our communities. But preserving at least some of the past, whether it's the distinctive architecture of a neighborhood or the types of plants that grow in a specific park, is a constant battle.
This stuff happens all over the world, but there's challenges where you have introduced plants from other areas that come in, and then they get a stronghold. Here you might call those invasive species, or you might, we think of them as weeds.
That's Robin Irizarry again. A lot of his work focuses on bringing back the natural integrity of Olney. And one of the biggest obstacles to that work are so-called invasive species.
Things like Japanese knotweed, kudzu vines. These are really aggressive plants that can take over a whole area. So we have to be mindful of how we try and manage those areas to restore some of the diversity of the plant landscape. And in turn, that's going to help us attract back some of the native wildlife that really depend on those plants.
And in thinking about Olney's biodiversity, there's a lesson to be learned in how the neighborhood has adapted to changing ethnicities and cultures.
And, one of the challenges is that these plants grow. There's not a lot of native natural predators that eat these things, so they have an advantage, right? And they can outcompete some of our native species. So a big part of maintaining and increasing biodiversity is restoring some of our green spaces to where we're managing these invasive species so that we don't have just one plant dominating an entire area.
It's a tempting metaphor to draw with respect to Olney's legacy of cultural diversity. You could see the push to preserve native plants as a parallel to anti-gentrification fights of today in the neighborhood. Or there's the opposite metaphor. The label invasive species could also apply to the way that immigrants, refugees, and foreigners have historically been made to feel unwelcome in a place like Olney. How we use terms that signify insiders and outsiders, whether it's about a park or a residential block, can be very powerful.
And I already talked a little bit when we were at the offices about just thinking about invasive species a little bit differently, and but also allowing them to sort of be a metaphor for folks feeling out of place and folks who are made to feel out of place because of where they were from or who they are.
After the gathering at the Cambodian Association in late April, a group who'd gathered for rice porridge and a history lesson on the Cambodian refugee settlement of Philly headed to the Tacony Creek Park. There, Seattle-based artist Sarah Cabbage introduced 3 pieces that are constructed from organic materials found in the park. She then created delicate sculptures out of invasive species.
When I was thinking about this work, it was almost like a way to envision a different future So, Surin, your question in the session was really potent. But just thinking about ways, trying to envision a different relationship between the vines and the trees, and one that was maybe more mutually supportive. And so, where the vines in this other alternative future are more like caregivers or protectors or friends or companions to the trees, rather than being seen as sort of invasive or damaging. And so just as a way of trying to think about a future where we are all valued, right? No matter where we come from or how we got here.
She's speaking about a spirit of sharing, which we could all spend more time thinking about these days when it comes to how we share space as neighbors and how we relate to the natural world. You can find Sarah Cavage's work at Tacony Creek Park and 16 other sites along the Delaware River watershed. Her project is supported by the Alliance for Watershed Education, which is where Robin works. They also supported Jay Coriano's work. This episode featured the solo piano piece entitled Tacony Creek, off of Professor Randy Gibson's Tacony Creek Suite album. You can learn more about Professor Gibson and his music in episode 2 of this podcast. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Audio Olney. In the next episode, we're going to explore faith and spirituality. You can find more information about our guest's work and this project at www.olneyculturelab.org and search for the Audio Olney podcast. You can also email us at audioolney@gmail.com. Be safe, everyone.